couple others. But yeah, Billy Joel's got a big middle C in his in the gate, and it's a magnificent house. You never see him though. Now I saw others, but that should be a great program. So, okay, to a much less positive topic, political violence and Judaism. And what does our tradition have to say? So obviously this is a timely subject, given the assassination of Charlie Kirk and the lawmakers in Minnesota, and just the assassination attempts over the summer. I mean, we're just living in, obviously, we all know, in a time of an uptick in violence, an uptick in rhetoric and extremist rhetoric, and a lot of fear. I mean, I think you see that, you feel it in the air, and militarizing in cities, Memphis, Chicago, obviously right now, and there. Anyone who follows the news knows each side, of course, blames the other, right? I mean, that's par for the course. And so I think, in fairness, I was just talking with Bob about empathy. And so empathy is an extraordinarily important skill, and also to be a good persuader in anything, you have to understand all sides of the argument. So let's look at, if you are coming from the political left, if you're a more liberal, why would you blame the right for uptick in political violence? I mean, the obvious first answer would be Trump, extremist rhetoric, January 6th. I mean, that's top of the line, right? You say, norms have been broken. Trump has said things that were clearly outside the bounds of political discourse. And then October 6th broke any idea that there aren't any implications. And I mean, that's just one, you could say there's so many other examples. So that would be the primary, I think, argument from the left, saying that the right is primarily responsible for political violence. And you could also make the argument that the government monopoly on violence has taken more extreme forms over the last few years. And so you could argue that that's contributed, sort of militarization of the police. I mean, this was discussed during the Black Lives Matter movement, that there is this kind of extremist, violent edge to the right. So that would be the argument coming from the left. From the political right, you would have, now, this is just sort of an overview for political violence, because I really want to look at Jewish texts. I mean, I'm not a political expert. I'm a rabbi, so we're going to get to text, but I just want to set the context. If you're coming from the political right, and you were to say political violence is primarily coming from the left, you would say, one, statistics show there's a more openness to political violence on the left. There are some interesting studies that say younger millennial progressives are more comfortable with the use of political violence, like that, and that's sort of those statistics are accepted across the board. So you would say that's bad, and then of course you would point to the recent murder of Charlie Kirk, who was really a very far right figure. So that would be, so the argument of the right would say the political left has given what you would say philosophically as a permission structure for violence, that it is legitimate to believe that for the right cause, you can be violent. Similar, by the way, I mean, there are certainly people on the right, extreme anti-abortion activists, who believe violence is okay. I mean, we know that that's so it's kind of the same logic to say that there is certainly not a majority, but a decent percentage of people, especially on the younger side, who say that for the right moral purposes, political violence is acceptable in some form. And nobody supports, murder, obviously, but there is an acceptance of some level of violence. So those are sort of the two different schools of thought. And the reality is it's becoming more urgent of an issue. And there's a very interesting generational divide. Basically, as the older several studies indicate the older the responder in the study, the more uncomfortable they are with political violence. That actually younger skews more accepting across the board, liberal and conservative. That's not, it's that one is not a political issue. And it doesn't really, there isn't really that much of a difference race-wise either. The categories, age seems to be the most salient factor. Am I missing anything? What are you, I mean, this is a smart group of people. Why do you think it skews so that younger people are more comfortable with political violence?
They see it.
One second.
They see it where?
Wait, I have to bring you the
Yeah.
mics, they can hear.
Okay.
I think that young people tend to have greater trust that they're gonna be all right. And they're not going to be harmed by the violence, or alternatively, they engage in intentional civil disobedience, and their civil disobedience involves being violent towards authority figures, and because of the history of the violence of authority figures to nonviolent people.
Right.
I was watching the Chicago police in 1968 line up, march from LaSalle Street to Michigan Avenue. I defended people who were not involved in protesting. And at that time, I believed that police were terrible people.
Right. Very interesting. So this history, so the history of sort of authoritarian violence, and that's a very interesting psychological observation. When you're younger, you kind of think everything's going to be all right. You sort of there's a less of an understanding of consequences, one might say. Okay. Yes.
Growing up in the 40s, 50s, 60s, we didn't see this.
Uh-huh.
When you say older people don't believe that much in violence, because we didn't grow up that way. This generation is growing up seeing this on television, on the media, these games, the videos. So I hate to say it, but they're kind of used to it.
That's very true. People do see violence. There have been several studies that say essentially people are inured to violence in many ways, that it doesn't shock younger people to see horrific violence on television. Sort of like, you've seen it so many times that you become used to it. That's a very good point. Yeah.
Being a 60s and 70s college radical,
Yeah.
I kind of differ from that. We didn't have video games, but we also didn't have the consequences. When you're young, you're enthusiastic, you have all that energy, and you don't think that, what about my kids? I've got a job to do. So you're really willing to stick your neck out in places that you wouldn't once you start to have responsibilities. But I certainly wouldn't blame it on games.
Right. Great point. And I think, this is very interesting. I mean, as a parent of a college student and two teenagers, I think about this all the time. You have to be so careful with what you say anytime. I mean, look at people who've gotten fired, in the wake of the Kirk assassination. You can kind of understand both sides, but people are, people put things up. People who grow up with social media write things that you wouldn't say to, you wouldn't actually say to a person. That's bad. People say insulting, awful things because they can type it that you wouldn't say to another person's face. Of course, that's just part of our human connection, even just when you're standing next to somebody. So, but because they wrote this online, people have lost their jobs. So yes, there are enormous consequences, which shifts. I think one of the things that we're going to get to is that within Judaism, words take on such significance. And there really is an idea in Judaism that textual battle replaces political conflict. That in a sense, it is argument and debate that that is a battle of ideas, and that sublimates the energy that's often used for political conflict. And that's that's in a sense the basis of democracy, right? That conflicting visions get negotiated within a political context, which is just language. It's words. Legislation, laws are words. So it very much, the idea of democracy fits with the ideas within Jewish theology. But speaking of that, let's pass this out. I think I made 40 copies, so some people may need to share. Thank you. Just gonna get some water. Any questions so far? Okay. The issue, so I'm going to start. I put together 15 different texts in rough chronological order on what can our Jewish tradition kind of enlighten us about how we manage political violence or violence generally. Because in a sense, religion exists to moderate human violence. Government exists to moderate human violence. This is the whole purpose of politics, of religious culture, is to create some social stability and harmony. And governments exist to have a monopoly on violence. So this is why political violence is such a central issue, because it can destabilize an entire society. It is kind of. They're actually a friend of mine who is a high up executive at the American Jewish Committee actually sent me a note that the leaders of very, very top tier Jewish organizations, a lot of them now have private security when they are traveling. And there are legitimate threats. That's just how it is. It's like certain CEOs and so forth. So this is not a wonderful time to exist as a leader. And so the idea, violence threatens very much core foundations of society. And it starts with the Cain and Abel story, right? This is sort of the paradigmatic civilizational story. When Cain rises up, God seems to prefer Abel's offering, and God really doesn't give an explanation. Cain gets upset, so Cain rises up and kills Abel. Good, thank you, Vanessa. And then it says, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." So this is the first act of political. It's political violence as understood in the rabbinic tradition. That there is a sort of core. There are different interests. People have different interests, and if there isn't a system for managing those differences, violence results. Okay, then we get to our next text, which. This is the prohibition, the first prohibition on murder. "Whoever sheds human blood, by human shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God, God made humankind." So this is sort of a acknowledgement in our tradition that violence can lead to violence. Therefore, avoid violence. Every human being is made in the image of God. There is a certain basis of equality. Okay, now, this is very interesting. This may be one of the first acts of true political violence, one could say, because Cain and Abel is more, that's a fratricide. Here is when Moses goes out into the field. You know this story. Moses goes out into the field. He sees an Egyptian taskmaster, or somebody who's, I guess, a foreman, some sort of supervisor, who is beating a Hebrew slave. And what does Moses do? Yeah, it says, it's very interesting. The text is, Moses is not a dumb guy. He looks to his left and he looks to his right. He makes sure no one sees him. So he clearly knows what he's about to do is not good. And he acts. What do you make of that? What do you make of that story? It's very interesting, isn't it? We know we know Moses has a big character flaw, that he loses his temper. That's, if you want to think of Moses as Achilles' heel, it's his temper. I mean, all the time, right? He takes the tablets and he shatters them when he sees. So this is Moses. So part of it tells us a little bit about Moses' character. Part of it is, I mean, if you want, we can look at it two ways. To justify violence, you could say the only way there was going to be a change was if there was some sort of violent act, because the system was such, slavery is not a system in which there is representation. So you can argue, and this is what some sort of professors who are on the very far left, very anti-Israel in my opinion, some of the theory they cite says that an oppressed people, the only way they can make their voice heard is through violence. I mean, there are some political theorists who believe that. I mean, arguably that's what Hamas was banking on. I mean, it's a horrible way to think, but there is some truth to it. So one could say the only way that Moses could get attention to this cause was if he acted. You could also say that Moses made a big mistake. You could say, actually, it was a terrible decision by Moses, because what happened? He had to leave and he's gone for 40 years. So one could say that actually, even if Moses's act was successful, it wasn't really successful because there is some sort of basis that we've seen this in Jewish tradition. Any comments about this too? Questions? Yeah, Todd, go ahead.
So the countervailing narrative is that Moses comes to the defense of someone who's helpless at this point. It's one of
Yes,
several
yes.
stories where Moses comes to the aid of others.
Yes.
And that's one of the
Good
reasons why
point.
God chooses him. So he's not defending himself, he's defending a third party who's helpless.
Very good point. Right. So another way to read this story is that Moses was preventing the death of the Israelite slave, that he was defending that person. So what's not really self-defense, but it was a just act because he was preventing a murder. Yeah, good. Okay. All right. Our next text is another act of political. This is a very famous story of Pinchas. So in the book of Numbers, there's a group of Israelites that suddenly become idolatrous worshipers with the Moabites, and they start living with Moabite women. It's really bad, And Pinchas is this very zealous Levite. He's a member of the priestly tribe, and he sees an Israelite becoming intimate with a Moabite woman, and he gets so angry that he takes a spear and he stabs it through the forehead of the Moabite. And he's rewarded by God for this act of zealotry, which is very interesting. It's very interesting. So obviously, this is not one of those stories we teach in Sunday school, but it is a story that does celebrate political violence, but very interestingly, the rabbis, the Jewish sages, they are much more critical of Pinchas. The Jewish sages say Pinchas took the law in his own hands, and as a result, according to the rabbis, his family could no longer be priests in the temple later on, in the Second Temple period. That Pinchas tarnished his family's legacy through this act of violence. So the rabbis, the Jewish sages, take a much more, you could call it conservative, or you could call it pragmatic or moderate, to say, actually, no, political violence really has no place in a legal society. This shows you a bit, and we're going to get to even more of that, but this shows you the kind of evolution of political thinking. In an earlier era, there is more violence, but as societies become more complex, as the Jewish people become larger, law begins to replace violence, like the West, like, you go out to the West at first, it's, law of the frontier, and then the sheriff comes, and so there is sort of this progress. Okay, then we get this next text. I wanted to include it because this is it shows some of the sophistication of the Torah. The whole concept of a city of refuge, the rabbis understood the concept of manslaughter, of, in a sense, accidental murder. When let's say, this happens with car accidents frequently, so somebody, unintentionally hits somebody and causes a death. It's the worst, but this happens. And this obviously happened in ancient Israel. And so in order to avoid a cycle of violence, because a cycle of violence is very, you kill one member of a family, then the family member will kill that member. And there's the Hatfields and the McCoys. That's very old. And so in order to prevent that cycle, the Torah has this concept of the cities of refuge, where people who were guilty of manslaughter could go and live and were protected from violence. And so it was an understanding that violence can destabilize a society. Okay, let's skip the next two texts. I want to go, okay. Number 9. So Maimonides Maimonides has many different texts, but his Law of Kings is really very focused on the ideal society. And he creates, in some ways, it might be the first checks and balances, or at least balance of power. He essentially says a sovereign, a king, really a king or any sort of political leader cannot wage war, can't declare war without the support of the Sanhedrin, which was the council of rabbis. So what he's essentially saying is that you need some sort of legislature, some sort of legislative imprimatur to a declaration of war, kind of what we have in the United States, except of course, there are exceptions. But the idea that one figure cannot unilaterally declare war, which is, again, it's sort of this evolution in how a society manages violence. This actually, you can really trace political development into how do you manage violence, how much violence is tolerated. Even obviously up until the 1960s, you had certain counties in the United States where violence was tolerated against, not even further than the 1960s. That's not, so there's, every system has had violence, has tolerated some levels of violence, and you actually see social progression when you tolerate less of it. Okay, I want to, any questions so far before we move to the next couple of texts? So we're moving kind of chronologically, and the next text is from number 10, is Nachmanides. And so Nachmanides is one of the great Torah commentators who lived in medieval Spain, or in France. He was in France, but he was a little bit later than Maimonides. And his commentaries are always very psychologically astute. And here he says, the Torah anticipates the corruption of kingship. It gives laws so that the desire for power will not destroy the covenant. And this is Nachmanides' comment on a verse in Deuteronomy that says one of the responsibilities of a king is that every king has to write their own Torah. The whole mitzvah of writing a Torah, which many congregations do, that comes from Deuteronomy. And the mitzvah is in some ways even more incumbent on the king. So the idea was every sovereign is bound by some higher power. In the case of the United States, it would be the Constitution. In the case of Judaism, it's God and Torah. And this text also seems to recognize that power can corrupt. People can justify violence through a variety of reasons. and oftentimes can create justifications because of some other ends. So Torah understands that. Questions, comments? Keep going. Everyone agree? Yeah, this is, okay, let's keep going. Okay. Let's actually turn favorite, where is, I didn't put it on here. Okay, even though it's my favorite, I guess I used a different text, but there's a text from Pirkei Avot, which says, pray for the welfare of the government, because were it not for the government, people would eat one another alive. This is what the text says. What do you think? What's the reasoning behind that? Pray for the welfare of the government, for were it not for the government, people would eat one another alive. Yes. David.
The red light red Hobbes.
Exactly. Yes. So Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, a very astute insight. Thomas Hobbes was the one who said life is nasty, brutish, and short, and that the only way people are not at each other's throat is if we have some sort of strong central government, essentially, that manages power, that manages people's impulses. You know, I mean, it's the logic is this, that society is always on the brink of instability, and were it not for enforcement of laws, people would steal, people would murder. It's sort of a very negative view of human nature in a way, and yet a realistic one. No, not everyone agreed with that, but that's right. Other comments on that? Yes.
I think.
1 minute, 1 minute.
Alrighty. It seems to me that we're seeing this in action right now with the government that we have allowing more and more acts of political violence by military, that everybody and his brother feels it's okay to go out and do something to someone of their neighbor when they get mad. I remember a time when the worst thing that happened in high school was some kids got into a fight, the male teacher trying to break it up actually had his arm broken. And we were horrified that such a terrible thing would happen in our school. And now it probably happens every day.
Yeah, it's a good point. What you're getting at, and this is that this actually also relates to many of the anti-Israel protests on college campuses. And that's this idea that there are certain political philosophies on the left and the right that, in a sense, legitimate political violence. That philosophies that do this. So let's start on the left. You have this sort of anti-colonial philosophy. You know, a guy named Edward Said, who was a professor at Columbia University, was very famous for this. And then he had a student who was a teacher at University of Chicago. This is the idea that the oppressed, again, it's sort of what I said at the beginning, the only way for their voices to be heard is violence. And historically, violence is the only thing that has worked. This is what that argument, which is not, I mean, that's certainly a debatable proposition, but it sees violence as a legitimate tool for political change. And that's certainly a point of view. I mean, Edward Said famously participated in the Intifada, and you know, so there is a kind of there is some sort of logic, and this is taught in some college campuses. Then on the extreme right, you do have, and you know, I like to follow. I like to understand every different point of view, and so occasionally I'll read something from a more conservative website, and the language that you hear is very much dehumanizing the other side. I've noticed that more lately, even, that said, you cannot work with these people at all. They're all crazy. They're all, you know, they want to kill us. You know, this is since the assassination of Charlie Kirk, you see this uptick sort of in people saying, all they want to do is kill us. So the only way we can win is to just totally destroy them. It's sort of this it's all or nothing thinking. And this obviously is extremely dangerous. That's actually, so that text that I talked to you earlier about, we pray for the welfare of the government because if not, people would destroy one another. That comes out of the first century of the Common Era, which was a period of intense political violence. I mean, Jesus was not the only Messiah figure. There were many Messiah figures of that period, and many of them were put to death. And there was constant, I mean, there was a Roman garrison atop the Temple Mount. So this was a time, talk about the presence of the National Guard. You had the Roman National Guard present right on. And so this was a time of intense violence. And so the rabbis understood that there should be some party with a monopoly on violence. I mean, so you have a view on the right. So there's that dehumanization that we hear on the right now, which is extremely dangerous. And by the way, it's not just the political right. You actually see it within Judaism as well. You see from the sort of very extreme right settlers and so forth, a real dehumanization of non-Orthodox Jews. I mean, in Israel, it's horrible. I mean, you've seen a little bit of it in the way the very far right. I mean, they say they care about the hostages, but I imagine if the hostages were more observant people, because they all came from very far left, they were at a music festival and they came from kibbutzes. You don't see that same kind of concern. It's very concerning to see that. But in any case, this dehumanization, and you have a sense for the very, very strong Second Amendment people that the only way that we don't want the government to have a monopoly on violence, that we have to protect ourselves, this idea of having conceal and carry. So there is both extremes have a kind of within certain quarters legitimate violence. And that is in some ways what our texts are warning against, that when there is some sort of permission structure for violence, that destabilizes a society. And it's quite, I think, quite concerning. There's another thinker I wanted to mention. His name is Rene Girard. Has anyone heard of Rene Girard? Anybody? So Rene Girard is a very interesting religious thinker. He actually taught at Stanford, and he developed the scapegoat theory, which was the idea that every civilization develops a scapegoat, and that having a scapegoat is a way of diffusing normal violent tendencies. That the scapegoat actually serves a very, he would say, a positive role. It's not positive for the scapegoat, but it reduces overall violence in a society. Kind of like having somebody to pick on unites people who have otherwise different interests. Like in the South, in pre-Civil War, you had, this horrible class system could be perpetuated because of racism, that united whites. So this is a general a tendency. And Rene Girard, I mean, he was a very strong Catholic. And so he said, he kind of saw Jesus as the ultimate scapegoat that got rid of the need for scapegoats. That was sort of his theology. But many other religions kind of drew from his thinking, in that he really believed that violence is pervasive in society, and that religion develops tools to moderate that violence. In a sense, tools of forgiveness, right? The whole concept of forgiveness was a way of avoiding the cycle of violence. I mean, forgiveness is a somewhat unnatural human act. It really, I mean, I guess some people, I mean, for family and things, we're quick to forgive, but anyone who's really been hurt by another person knows that it's extremely hard to forgive. And so it's kind of our human nature. So it's very radical to promote forgiveness. So Girard would say that many of the ideas within religion exists to kind of sublimate that human violence. And Rene Girard would also say, and he did talk about this, that as societies lose their sort of foundational religious basis, they become more violent. And they're actually, again, America, if you look at statistics over the last, starting around 2000, you begin to see a serious drop in commitment to organized religion. Whereas at one point, over 50% of Americans went to church or synagogue on a regular basis. Now it's 25%. I mean, it's half. And the number of people who describe themselves as spiritual but not religious has doubled. That's the fastest growing category. Now, interestingly, the most recent study that just came out a few months ago actually said that decline has stabilized. It's no longer declining. It's kind of, so it's actually, it might have reached the low point and maybe uphill from there. But in any case, our society has become less religious, even though you see people, like you see the extreme religious right, and they're very vocal, but actually even the more conservative denominations are not growing like they once did. So our society has become less religious. I mean, even look at the presidents. Didn't it used to be expected that the president would go to church on Sunday? That was sort of, yeah, since maybe Obama, has not, I mean, I don't think any of the presidents have gone on a regular basis. I don't know. What's that? Biden, right? He went to church. He did. That's right. Saturday nights. Yes. So Biden was, I mean, Biden is of an older generation, right? I mean, that has certainly, that has declined. But I'm using the presidents as kind of an example of this sort of decline. So some people connect a more acceptance of violence with the decline of religion, which I think is a very interesting explanation. Okay, comments, questions. What do you think? What do you think is responsible for the uptick in political violence? I mean, I think many of us probably think a big chunk of it goes to Trump. But what is the role? I mean, here's the question. I think this is very difficult to answer. And I have conflicting feelings about this. But sometimes we maybe put too much emphasis on words. Like I used to say, there's that famous quote, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me." And I used to say, well, that's a horrible quote, because words can hurt people, right? You say something awful, that is extremely hurtful. I mean, anybody who's married, anybody who has friends, we all, you all say things you regret sometimes, but aren't words, if you do have angry feelings, isn't it better to say them than to take them out physically? I mean, are we regulating words too much? I mean, there is really this, again, this goes back to free speech. Does maximizing free speech reduce the propensity to violence? And maybe that we become too self-censoring, one might say. Anyone agree? What else? What else explains this uptick in violence? Why are we just worse people? Yeah, Rick, go ahead.
I think a part is the vilification of the other,
Yes.
and whether the other are Jews or blacks or immigrants. I think the propensity to blame somebody else can create emotional and at times physical retribution.
Yeah. But here's what this is one that I've been struggling with, because I'm doing a lot of reading as I was thinking about this topic. Why, if we get angry at the other, there are many, I mean, President Obama won 2 elections by a lot. And a lot of counties that voted for Obama later voted for Trump. So if they voted for Obama, they obviously are not so hateful. I mean, so what changed? Why? why is there more demonization of the other now? Is it simply social media? I mean, there is a very good argument to be made that social media thrives on othering, on promoting, like that. The more extreme you are in your language, the more clicks you get, and the more clicks you get, the more money you make. I mean, that's basically that's basic commerce online. And so you are incentivized to use extreme language so you get more clicks. And the companies that manage it, the more time you spend online, the more money they make. So they're incentivized to deliver more extreme things. So all the incentives are aligning for more extreme rhetoric. So that does warp people's thinking. There's no question. Okay, yeah. Barbara.
I got the mic.
Oh, okay. Go ahead then, Barbara.
So there's an old cliche,
Yeah.
basically, if it bleeds, it leads,
Oh, yes.
Yes.
which was not the point I originally wanted to make. I think that we kind of didn't pay enough attention to the fact that the younger generation has been desensitized to violence in video games and through the rhetoric they see. And the things that just hit my brain during all this political violence was Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy and other things. And a lot of this political violence taking place, the guy who killed Kirby wasn't an impulsive act. And the guy July 4th was not an impulsive act. And each of them had access to guns much more readily than your generation or my generation.
Mhm.
And I think it's so you can't.
So it's not monocausal. There are
They-
many different causes. And that makes it very hard to manage. It very. So, I was talking about some of the philosophical sort of permission structures, and that's true. But there are so many other factors. The ease of access to guns. I mean, that's without question. It is easy anywhere. I mean, even in places with strict, I mean, it's harder in places with strict gun laws, but you can cross state lines. There's just so many ways people can access violence. Yes. Who else had their hand up? Barbara and then Jerry.
And then Andy's on the.
Okay, great.
Onset.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah, Art, Jerry, and.
Well, I was going to start talking about the social media. I think with a lot of problem with the social media too, is that it's not very social. We are no longer, I think a lot of this generation, this younger generation, doesn't know how to socialize face to face with other human beings. They're spending their whole time on media. And I think that that's a really big problem in learning how to survive.
I think you're right. I think people are going, this is I was just talking about this with my wife, I think in 10 to 15 years, most schools are not going to allow phones during the day in school. And I think several already have. And I'm going to think, and I think that the culture will shift that people will get phones later. Unfortunately, I was of the generation where it was like, oh, this is great, let's go, and it's not great for kids. It's like a drug. I mean, it addicts you. And some kids are fine. Obviously, it doesn't hurt all kids, but other kids get sucked in. Yeah.
In our wonderful Jewish religion,
Yeah.
we have a concept that you save a life, you
Yes.
save
Yes.
the world.
Yes.
Another concept we have is that the world is sort of divided between good and evil, and your action can take the weight. You can be the force that turns the world into a better place. So what do these things mean? These things mean that as an individual, you are important. You count. Your behavior matters. I think in our society now, more and more, we're being depersonalized. We're finding that we have no effect at all. You call up the telephone company and you can be on the phone for an hour and nobody seems to care. So
Kafkaesque, yeah, it's Kafka.
so it's very important that we have to first back in the equation that everybody is important.
Well, this is so true. And that is such another thing. I mean, I've been thinking a lot. I mean, I did a talk, what was it, like 7 months ago about AI. And things have changed dramatically since then. And I actually think as as AI becomes more infused into the workplace, and people will lose jobs, I don't know at what rate, there's no question about it in my mind. I think that places like a synagogue, which is, I guess, good for our business in a sense, but that the face-to-face contacts are going to become even more important. Things like theater, actually, when we human being, social interaction is like oxygen. You can't survive without it. You can't. People go crazy. That's why solitary confinement is it's a cruel and unusual punishment. I mean, and so we need that contact. And yes, people don't have it as much. And it's sad. I mean, it's no one's fault really, except technology. It's we choose convenience. It's hard to counter, but we will. Yeah.
We have, wait, Andy.
Okay.
Wait, Andy, go ahead.
Okay, well, I just, back to the question of why the violence.
Yeah.
And a lot of I don't think it's one reason, but I think there's the concept of bandwagon behavior. And I think that's accelerated by social media and everything being so fast. So there's never a pause. And I think it, just like in the natural world, climate change is accelerated because things are going so fast, nature has no time to catch up. And I think this is applicable to this kind of thing. It's just, everything is.
I think that word bandwagon, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's one of the things that Renee Girard said, and this was very astute, is that everybody lives by, he called it mimetic desire, mimesis, that we are imitators. We are the imitation animal. Just like, so the easiest way to illustrate this idea is probably not the most politically correct, but let's say you are a young man or a young woman, and let's say you and your friend, there's a woman, and your friend suddenly takes an interest in that person, and then maybe you look at that person a little differently. Oh, I take an interest. That we model ourselves. If somebody buys, or if you and your neighbor both have the same car, and then suddenly your neighbor buys a really nice car, you might think, oh well, maybe I should have a nice car too. That's in some ways, not everybody, and we change over, we mature over time, but in many ways, there's advantages to that. There are advantages. When you were tribal, you follow the leader in many ways. And I think in some ways, some of that is still built into so I think one of the reasons, what your comment made me think of, Andy, is the way a president speaks, and the way any leader speaks, it automatically has an effect on other people, because unconsciously, even if you don't meaningfully start changing how you speak, it happens. That's just what Girard would say. There's just a mimetic effect, especially in an era with such technology. So absolutely, there extremist language from a very public figure allows it to permeate a society. It's a huge danger. Yeah, I mean, we all know that. It's sort of common sense, but Girard explains why that is. It's because this mimetic tendency is somebody who has such high power seems to be rewarded. So if you are rewarded, if society rewards extreme language, then there will be more extreme language. That's it's basic evolution. So a culture, that's why Judaism has always had a very literary and intellectual culture, and that moderates violence. But and this brings up so many interesting issues. There was a fascinating article, I think it was in the Forward just a week ago, and it was has the Gaza war changed Judaism? That there are, in a sense, there are people who are critical of Israel in many ways, who say that there is this kind of, in some ways, a legitimization of violence, that this is kind of exposed a kind of very strong nationalism. We've always had Zionism as part of Judaism. I believe that with all my heart, but there is there is a segment within Israeli society that is very extreme and violent. And that has a stronger voice in society now than it did 20 years ago. And so, I mean, Jerry, you've got some stories, I remember you telling me, so there is, that group has more political power now than it did. So there are people that are worried that that our sense of Judaism is becoming, in a sense, is changing because of the war, and also as a reaction to so much anti-Semitism. There is when people accuse you of something, you get defensive. So there is concern among, even among the Orthodox. Some very thoughtful Orthodox rabbis have talked about this. So that in effect, cultures change a lot based on leadership. Yeah.
I think that we have lost our community.
Yes.
We have lost our ties.
Yeah.
There was always violence, but there was a respect, and we have lost that, and our need to be with people.
Yeah.
Since the pandemic, people are more isolated. You left some friends and, oh, I don't need this one, I don't need that one. And I think it goes back to responsibility and what you want someone to think of. When I was a child, I behaved somewhat because I didn't want the greater people to think I was a bad person. Nowadays, nobody cares.
Yeah, my parents would say, your behavior reflects on us. I was like, okay,
Exactly.
okay. Yes, very nice. You're right.
So I heard Al Dershowitz speak on an Israeli broadcast, and he pointed out two things. He said, first of all, historically, the younger generations have always been more radical and
That's true.
radical, they brought Hitler, they brought Pol Pot, and they brought Castro. I mean, he went through example after example after example, including, the 60s here. But what he also talked about was the anti-social media, that it drives people apart because each group gets a feed that's designed to feed the most radical part of them.
Yeah.
So if you come from the left, the media will feed you just the radical part of the left. If you come from the right, the media will feed you the radical part of the right. And so it creates that divide of us versus them, just on steroids.
It's amazing. I think you're right. And I think I read a wonderful article. There is a concept in business, in media, of conflict entrepreneurs. So these are people who created media companies that essentially fomented and thrived on conflict. I mean, in fact, CBS, if you read the New York Times, just bought the Free Press for $150 million. She's my age, and she started that. She's and I mean, she started from nothing and created this $150 million, essentially based on that idea of kind of feeding people. I mean, it's a good news. I mean, she's great authors and so forth, but it is very clearly divisive. And there are many other media companies like that. So the companies that have thrived are the ones who foment greater extremism. Conflict entrepreneurs. That was just such a it's sad, but that's what's rewarded. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
At the beginning of your talk,
Yeah.
you raised a question about violence, Judaism.
Yes.
My first thought was that Judaism hasn't been very violent since Bar Kokhba, and certainly until the revolts against the Nazis in the camps and in Warsaw. But I was thinking that there's a change. The change in my mind is suddenly we have the Jewish people have a place to protect,
Yes.
which since Bar Kokhba's day we have not had.
Well, this is a very interesting question. Good place. So there's a theory called the lachrymose theory of Jewish history, which was this idea that Jews have been powerless since the Romans destroyed the temple. Jews have been a powerless political actor at the mercy of other nations, which in one sense is true, but in another sense not true because we were very creative. But what I want to get to is historically, Jews have been associated with political passivity, and that was a negative for the early Zionists. There was a very famous poet, named Chaim Bialik, one of the great, he wrote this very famous poem called Act of Slaughter. And it was a poem about a pogrom. I can't remember if it was about Kishinev pogrom. I think it was, but it might have come out. It was about a horrible pogrom. And the poem imagines the men hiding behind walls as the Cossacks murder and rape the women. And it's a very negative, it is attacking passivity. And it's a difficult poem to read, but it was a critique of that model of Eastern European weak Jew. And the Zionists were trying to reverse that model, cultural model, and saying, actually, we're strong and we're tough, which is how Zionism was built. You have to have an army, you have to have training, you have to have seriousness. And so there is a shift within Judaism. This is, by the way, where some of the, and this is such an interesting history, the more religious political parties were actually the more pro-peace parties before 1967. In the 1940s and 1950s, the religious parties were the peaceniks. It was the Labor Party that was the aggressor. David Ben-Gurion, I mean, there were extremes that were even more, but the Labor Party was the party that was the military party. The religious parties were the more dovish parties. That reversed for a variety of reasons we can discuss. But so Judaism, the religion, was associated with passivity and the scholar rather than the warrior. Whereas Zionism tried to shift that to focus on the warrior rather than the scholar, or at least merge, be a scholar and a warrior. So absolutely a major cultural shift. Well, we covered a lot, but I think the overall, I think part of the beauty of Judaism is that we have always had differences of opinion, and we've always had systems for managing those differences of opinion. In some ways, the Bar Kokhba, the failure of the Bar Kokhba revolt was, in a sense, the end of a kind of monolithic Judaism, and Judaism became much more focused on debate in a sort of prototypical democracy based on language, based on Talmud. And so I think that's a system, that's a model for what America should be, what I think America was built on, and that's threatened by political violence. And I think part of our task is to articulate the importance of debate and discussion. So hopefully we'll continue this discussion. I think at our next talk, we'll do a little update on what's happening in Israel, because we'll probably know a little bit more about that next time. So I'll see you then. Yeah. Yeah.
We're open for